I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico, your youth pastor this week.
And I'm Dean Detloff, and I'm your parent volunteer this week.
Ooh, did you bring the cookies?
I did. I brought them, but I did have to swing by the local store to buy them. I did not bake them at home. I forgot until just this moment.
Fair enough. That's fine. The teens don't care. They just want the cookies.
This week on the show, we're talking with Amaryah Armstrong, who you actually just heard, unbeknownst to you. Amaryah does the music for the Magnificast. She made us those very, very good beats that you hear in the beginning. She even has a quote in the very beginning there, too. I guess now you can find out which one it was as you hear her speak. But we decided to have her back on the show for a lot of reasons, mostly because it's just been way too long since she's been here, but also because she wrote a fantastic article for The Bias called... Sorry, you're going to have to edit this. Christian Order and Racial Order, What Cedric Robinson Has to Teach Us Today. It's a really, really fantastic introduction to Cedric Robinson as a theorist and also to kind of the nest of issues involved in Christians and how people are reacting to the unrest that's going on right now and all that kind of stuff. It all comes together in that very cool piece.
Yeah, it's such a good article. I really love it. I was telling Dean beforehand that the intervention that Amaryah brings against Christianity, and I mean like white Christianity in this article, is really helpful. And it should be devastating, but I think it's actually kind of really freeing. That you don't have to do the mental gymnastics of trying to always find the way that Christianity is good and pure for you or something. It helps you kind of understand that what you really need to do is kind of come to some kind of deeper understanding about all of the evil that Christianity has done. And I appreciate those types of those interventions into my life and my brain. And now you can appreciate it too in this conversation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it can be hard to hear at first, but it does really help as you let it sink into your bones. So in the conversation, we hear from Amaryah about Cedric Robinson, some of the tools that he gives us to think, and also the tools that Amaryah gives us to think about, or to think with as she draws from his work and elsewhere. And also we end up returning to all kinds of classic Magnificast themes like, why is Christianity so bad? And what are you supposed to do with it? What should you do with it? Etc.
All right, let's go to Amaryah.
At the end of every episode of the Magnificast, we announce that the intro music is by you, Amaryah, our guest today. So people should be familiar with you from some past episodes on this, but also every single episode of the Magnificast, whether they know it or not. But you've got a lot more accolades than being just a very good podcast music composer. So why don't we just let you introduce who you are?
Yes, well, I feel like it's not every day that I'm introduced as a podcast music composer, so I think that's pretty cool and an accolade I'm very excited about. Hey, get from under there. My dog is walking under my desk. Sorry.
You can introduce your dog too. That can be another guest.
Yeah, special guest Sage. My dog is being kind of an asshole right now. Yeah. No. Yeah, other than doing podcast music composition, I guess I also work as an assistant professor of race and American religion and culture at Virginia Tech. And I'm also a co-host of the Assembly podcast on the Political Theology Network. And yeah, one of these days we're going to have to do a crossover episode.
Yeah.
Cool. That'd be very cool.
Yeah.
Well, we wanted you to come on today to talk about an article that you wrote recently for The Bias called Christian Order and Racial Order, What Cedric Robinson Has to Teach Us Today. It's a really great piece, and everyone should go out and read it. We'll make sure we link it and post about it some more. But before we get into it, can you just tell us a little bit about what the article is about? Like, what's the elevator pitch for the piece?
Yeah. I guess the elevator pitch for the piece is, in the wake of all this kind of Black protests and uprising in the U.S., there's been a lot of talk of law and order, and I don't know. I guess a curious thing that happens to me is I think Christians either have an idea of order that's on the side of law and order kind of policing stuff, or an idea of order that supposedly critiques that. And I was trying to show the kind of relationship between Christian ideas of order and racial ideas of order by thinking with Cedric Robinson, who's this Black radical thinker. This is not an elevator pitch, I'm realizing.
It can be a long elevator.
The piece is essentially trying to think with his idea of order and how it still has resonance for understanding what's going on today, and the relationship between theological and political ideas of order.
That's great. Some buildings are really tall, so that is totally an elevator pitch, and that's just fine. It's a really good essay. It's really fun, and also I don't know, I appreciate it because you do a good job summarizing Cedric Robinson, which is not an easy thing to do, I don't think.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. So one way that you frame the essay is by challenging this narrative, not only about order, but about kind of separating nonviolent good protesters from violent or destructive bad protesters. So one quote that you have toward the beginning, you say, "Violent protest, we are told, is a threat not only to the legitimacy of the protest, but also as a threat to the very social order of the United States." And I think that might be just a good way to kind of get into the conversation a bit. What exactly do you think that story does for how we look at protests and uprisings, and then also the kind of so-called normal state of things or the normal terms of order?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of moralization that goes on or that happens whenever something like looting or physical kind of defense or any other kind of forceful pushback happens during protests. And the narrative is kind of oh, this is delegitimizing violence or looting or something. And part of what I think I was trying to call attention something I was trying to call attention to is how it seems like there's an assumption that protests are supposed to be trying to restore the social order that they're protesting against, which seems like a kind of silly way to think about what a protest is. And actually the normal social order is one where police are using violence all the time with exceptional amounts of power in totally brutal and death-dealing ways. And that is actually how the social order of the US is constituted. And so I guess I was trying to call attention to how, like, if that's what order is, you know, like, of course, it makes sense to violently protest against that order. It makes sense to, like, uh, engage in disorderly behavior because what makes order in this country is, like, built on a lot of anti-Black violence that just is what keeps things running.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I'm always really fascinated when people who are really good at thinking about things like you are can kind of help us, correct the narrative, right? That protests aren't just protests or riots or whatever, right? Aren't just like random outbursts of activity, but they have like a logic to them. I think that's really helpful. Um,
Totally, yeah.
yeah. Well, maybe we could talk a little bit more about like the way that you're using order from Robinson. Yeah, like your article is drawing on Cedric Robinson, and you're calling attention to like the formative racializing logic in capitalism that gets like sidelined by socialists, defaulting to questions about class, oppression, or economics. Right, like they're kind of missing the boat. Could you introduce us to Cedric Robinson a little bit more and what his project is and like what you find especially useful about his work and maybe what you want more people to take away from it?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like I'm still, like, trying to still feel like a student of his work in many ways, and am really excited about his work and want to share it as much as I can. But I definitely am like, don't feel like an expert on him. But as I understand Cedric Robinson and his project is, it seems twofold to me. And like one part of his project is a critique and kind of historicization of uh, Western political thought, including like Marxist thought, as like um, kind of historically uh, kind of positioning itself as universal arbiter of uh, norms of like civilization, existence, etc. But this universal narrative has a history, and that history is European. So this whole kind of Western political order is like assumes a certain kind of normative universality when it really is derived from this very like particular set of um, existential and like epistemological kinds of histories. And so um, I feel like that's like one arm of his critique is kind of like historicizing Western political economy and its history as this European lineage, including Marxism and talking about the proletarian that Marxism imagines in this kind of universalizing way as like historically related to like the kind of material formations happening in Europe. And so he's really kind of well known for his formulation of racial capitalism, which essentially talks about how, within this European kind of order of knowledge, it's already a kind of racialized idea of existence. And so the emergence of capitalism is not something that precedes race or a race idea, but actually like depends on it and is like emerges with and through this European racial imagination. So that's like, one element of his critique. And then I feel like the other side of his work is really kind of drawing attention, I feel like, to the kind of creative ways, I guess, or resources in Black radical thought for like both critiquing Western order, but also having like a different imagination of society and of life together that is like critical of the political assumptions about order and law and things like that that are so pervasive in the West. So yeah, I feel like that was kind of a rambly way about it, but essentially he has a critique of Western politics and also a more like constructive piece that's rooted in like the resources from Black radical traditions for a different way of existing and understanding reality.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. It makes sense too of that sort of weird habit that you point out of a lot of socialists, especially now, kind of reducing everything to class, and then race becomes maybe like an epiphenomenon or like a tool of the bourgeoisie rather than constitutive of that that kind of order.
Yeah, I think there's a narrative that's like, oh, race emerges as a way to divide this working class. And I think for Robinson, it's more like, and I think this also like, just like thinking about the research that I've done around like Christian theological ideas of peoplehood and race, these things seem to work to make sense together. But I think Robinson is like, no, Europe already has a like racial idea, even like prior to the emergence of capitalism. So it's not that somehow like race is introduced later as a like justification for like a class division. Not saying that it can't be used that way, obviously, but I think he's trying to draw attention to the fact that there's this like existential element of like racial capitalism too, that's about like governing existence and like arranging the distribution of not just like goods and money, but also like the social value of people's lives. And like that element of like capitalism can't be accounted for without understanding like race as central to it and not something that is just like an effect of capitalism.
Yeah, that is super helpful. And that the way that you bring in that work that you've done, like you were saying on the theological side, I was just sort of chuckling to myself, I guess, because it seems like Christians you would hope would be able to actually understand that point by virtue of the Christian history of race. But obviously that's kind of the whole point, is that Christians don't get it because they or we have sort of invented it in a really bizarre and awful kind of way. And you draw some of those kinds of relationships out in your essay, like you reference, for example, Robinson's observations on the problems of redemption themes in European politics. So maybe that might be just one way of kind of connecting these dots a little bit more. Could you say something about how redemption works in politics and how it's tied into racial and colonial capitalist projects?
Yeah, so something interesting about what Cedric Robinson is doing is he's not just like, he has a book called The Terms of Order, which is where a lot of my thinking was with in that article. But he's not just trying to track ideas of order, he's also trying to like track a kind of like related idea of authority. And he talks about like this idea of the charismatic leader in Western politics as this figure who's seen as kind of like emerging from the people, but then like having a certain authority that like puts them in a position like above them, or kind of like an authority over. And I think part of what he's trying to get at is like, or I think part of what he sees is there's like a certain kind of connection between this like theological idea of redemption and how it's imagined that salvation happens, and like political ideas of order and how it's imagined that political change happens through this kind of salvific charismatic leader figure. And so I think that's like one element of how he's trying to like think about the relationship between redemptionist ideas in Christian history, European history, and in politics. But then I think he's also like pointing to, or maybe this is more of like the connection that I'm making between like the work I've done in theology and his work. But I think he also draws attention to like how theology, Christianity presumes a certain kind of order to history that's like oriented by redemption, and that kind of like idea of redemption history shapes a lot of how people perceive God at work in the world, God ordering things in the world. And I think part of what he is talking about is how there's a kind of like presumption of order as like a necessary thing to make sense of the world, and like how do we get that? And it seems kind of inherited from this kind of Christian redemptive idea of like order and being able to like perceive it in the workings of the world. So I think he's also trying to like draw attention to like political ideas of order and their presumption of order as like necessary and normative. And I think he's really kind of trying to draw attention to like how perception of order is like shaped by all these things that get covered over because it's just assumed to be the way that things are. So I think he's really trying to draw attention to like, you know, I guess like an example that I've thought about myself is like, if you're like arranging things and you like set something, like if you set something out of place so that it's not within your arrangement anymore and you're just focusing on the things that you've arranged, you're creating order by like reducing what one's attention is on, or by like training your eyes to look at certain things and not other things. So I think he's trying to draw attention to like how these ideas of like order or like some kind of like governance being necessary kind of leaves out the fact of like the decisions that are made on like what to focus on or how to arrange things, and the effects that that has on like how we like live, but also how we claim to know things about reality and the world.
As you're saying all of this, I guess the image that just keeps popping in my brain is, I'm sure everyone's seen it by now, but there's like a really popular video from, I mean, I guess I don't even know what city, but it's a video of a lot of like white people kind of standing around like in this like sort of prayerful position.
Oh God.
Yeah, kind of doing. Do you know what I'm talking about? Doing like the kind of
Is
like
this the like confessional video or something?
Yeah,
God.
kind of like confessing their own complicity in white supremacy and racism. And I guess I mean when you're talking about
so bad.
Yeah, it is so bad. When you're talking about the way order covers over things, I'm thinking about that video, about how that is like the biggest distraction and the biggest.
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, do you think of that weird presentation maps on to Robinson's idea here?
Yeah, I mean, so I think something that's always striking to me about like certain postures of anti-racism is like they're really modeled on a Christian idea of conversion. You know, this idea that you're going to like, you've had some kind of transformation and now you're going to go evangelize to your racist uncle, and you're equipped with the truth of anti-racism, and you're going to like convert your racist uncle into being anti-racist or something. Like that. And then also like the need for some kind of like confession and absolution through confession as like how racism, like as the first step towards like fighting racism or something. And I find that like, one, I find that super ineffective and obnoxious, but like two, I think it also is like a hindrance for people in actually like having their realities transformed or like their lives changed in a more substantial way, because I think it really is oriented by this kind of like confession and absolution model and this idea of like conversion, but it's not a like conversion to like doing a certain kind of work. It's like a conversion to confess. And like that is like the orientation of it. And I guess I'm just like, please, like I would be really just so upset if any white person ever tried to do that to me, because I would just be like, why are you putting this on me? Like, I don't want your confession, you know, like that's between you and your bad feelings. And yeah, so I guess like to me it seems like it really is just retains a certain orientation to like redeeming white people in some way, whether it's through like converting them, and then like through confession they'll find redemption, you know, through absolution from Black people or something. I want none of that, but it's a very pervasive kind of model for like what anti-racism is supposed to look like. And I think part of why it's like a very kind of popular model is precisely because like Christianity and its ideas of conversion and confession are so like widespread as a kind of common sense of what like transformation looks like in our like common imagination.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. I mean, I guess I guess the pattern that emerges for me is that Christians are just always really quick to try to dodge culpability, or that transformation for some reason like frees you from that culpability, that you or frees you from, you know, the past sins altogether, and now you don't have to worry about them anymore. And I don't know. I agree. I mean, I think that it is ineffective and bad for all the reasons that you said.
I think the thing that always like bothers me so much is I think I'm just like, how are you like confessing for something that you don't even understand the extent of yet, you know?
Yeah.
And I think it's like, okay, so like you saw this video and it made you sad or whatever, you had some kind of reaction, which is like totally cool, like understandable. But to me, it's like, if you recognize that like you haven't been paying attention to like anti-Blackness in this country, and now you're realizing that you need to do that, it seems to me like what you need to understand is like the depth to which you like haven't understood, if that makes sense. And it always seems to me like these ideas of confessions, like I don't like the ideas of confession, but if it's to have any use, right, it seems like one has to actually do some kind of like interrogation prior to confession, where you actually come to terms with like the level of harm that's been done and are able to like articulate that in order to confess, you know. But what you actually have is just white people being like, oh, like we apologize for the sin of racism or something, which is like so generic as to be meaningless. So to me, I'm just like, you don't even understand like the specificity of the harm that is occurring or the depths to which it organizes our society. How are you apologizing and confessing for something like in any real way, even if you like take confession as valuable, you know?
Yeah, I mean, as you're speaking, I just kept thinking of other images of like Justin Trudeau like taking a knee at a protest or something.
Oh God.
Yeah. Or cops taking a knee too, but especially like political figures in particular. And one thing the article just kind of made me think about is how because Christianity is part of the governance of the world, or the kind of like infrastructure of the governance, however you want to put it, maybe there's a way in which these are kind of analogous situations. Like it's bizarre to see Trudeau kneel at a protest because like people are protesting Trudeau. So, it's kind of like, what are you doing? And I wonder, do you think there's something similar going on there too with this kind of performative confession of Christians, that it's, the protest is in, maybe explicit or implicit or whatever, but the protest is against a kind of Christian ordering of the world. So that might be part of it. I don't know.
Oh, that makes total sense. Oh, wow. No, so I hadn't even thought about it like that, but that's a really great point of one of my long-standing critiques of Christianity is that it's like very good at like assimilating critiques of itself in such a way as to like neutralize them. And I think that kind of like move to confess in order to like attain a kind of absolution is like precisely like how that often happens. Like I think there's often these like people who are like, oh, the church needs to lament for the sin of racism or something. And I always like find that like I've always find that like weird, I guess. Like I guess I'm just like to me the thing the church needs to do, or Christianity needs to do, or whatever, is like become responsible and accountable for the harm that it's caused, which like I'm just like, I don't care about like white people feeling like sad or something about racism, which like if those are the feelings that people have, that's like fine, like, but that doesn't need to be the basis of like a political demand with regards to how the world is set up and how it's ordered. So I think that's like, you're really wise to point out that there's a way that like this Christian order is being contested, and it's like precisely in claiming to like accept that contest that it actually like just like reproduces its like governance of the world in some way.
Yeah, well, I think maybe we can pivot the conversation in a little bit of a different direction. So these protests are happening, and like a lot of Christians are having a hard time affirming the real challenges to order, and they're really quick to double down on non-violence, right? That's what good Christians are supposed to be about, I guess.
Yeah.
So and they want to separate themselves out from the violent protests, right? This whole thing we kind of talked about already with order. But I guess like why do you think Christians do that, especially with regard to violence? Is there a similar logic to it that we were just kind of talking about, or is there something different going on there? Like, what is it about Christianity that makes this really hard for Christians to think through with regard to violence and protest?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think there's a few things going on. One of which, to me, I understand that kind of distinction as like a power move that people make. And part of like the power that lies in that move is like making creating a distinction and then determining the boundaries of those distinctions in order to like justify one's perception of the world. And part of what seems so inadequate to me about that kind of distinction is these protests, these uprisings are like contestations of how people have been perceiving the world and their sense of how things are or how they should be. And so to me, when people make those kinds of distinctions, what they're doing is like refusing to see what's happening. They're refusing to see, you know, the they're refusing to see like the multitude of reasons why people would be angry enough to burn down a police station, or why people would be so kind of worn down and exploited by this racial capitalist police occupied like situation that so many Black people inhabit, that they would loot a Target. And to me, like, part of what that kind of distinction allows is for people to not have to see the people who like challenge their perception of the world. And so by kind of like separating the wheat from the chaff, essentially, they're able to like reconcile the protests to what they already think about the world, instead of actually having something else revealed to them about what's happening.
That seems to go back to what you were just saying, right? About Christianity being the order that's being protested, but that's why Christians not only kind of can't see it as such, but they also try to maybe suck in the parts of it that they can and condemn the rest of it or something. And yeah, that brings me to a moment in your essay that I think is really helpful for at least clarifying some of this. So, you draw out that a white supremacist order is a form of, or it's a Christian form of order. So I'll read kind of like a little bit of a long quote, but I think it's really helpful the way you put it. So you say, today it's very popular for Christian leftists to announce God is on the side of the oppressed, that a divine order of liberation and redemption is a challenge to this political order, and that Christian nationalists are misappropriations of the true liberative core of the Christian message. While these announcements have their use, they also carry the danger of erasing both the history of Christian order as the maintenance of racial order and the Black radical work that went into making Black life theologically meaningful, valuable, and a source of theological knowledge. I think that a lot of listeners would read a passage like that and still wonder why it might be so bad to say that, authentic or true Christianity is really on the side of the oppressed, or trying to figure out what it means exactly to affirm that Christianity is part of this racial order. So could you explain a little bit further why you want to resist, on the one hand, that conflation of Christianity and true liberation, and then on the other hand, why you want to help Christians affirm Christianity's complicity in building all this stuff?
Yeah. I think there's a real desire by many Christians to be like, how can we make Christianity good again? Or make it the good guy? And to me, I'm like, that ship sailed with Christopher Columbus, probably before that. But like, actually, that's like an unethical question to ask given Christianity's history. And to me, I think that Christians often like to keep things within this like moral framework of like good or bad, like how can we make Christianity good, as opposed to the bad Christianity that Christian nationalism is. And I think the reality of Christian history is that it's not just a kind of like evangelical fundamentalist Christian nationalism that is the source of an anti-Black order in the world. It's also like very Orthodox, Anglican, Methodist, Baptist, whatever, mainline Catholic, like very core and sophisticated theological ideas and views that were the source of creating and sustaining the racial order of the West. And so to me, this desire to say, well, the true core of Christianity is liberative, is to, again, make a kind of distinction, right, between the good and the bad in order to separate out what people think of as some kind of impurity or some kind of distortion of the true thing from the good thing. And to me, that is, again, a power move that kind of preserves one's perception of things and how they should be. And I think the challenge of Black existence, the challenge of Black uprising, the challenge of Black radical knowledge is a challenge to that kind of power move of making this distinction between the pure and the impure, or the true core and the false kind of appearance, and saying that Christianity is what it has done. And in order to actually confront the state of the world in a way that's adequate to the suffering that Black people experience, in a way that's adequate to the like courage and the creativity that Black people have exhibited in the wake of 400 years of oppression and still going. Like, the only way to become adequate to that demand that Black life and existence makes on our understanding of the world is to like really have a reckoning with the fact that you can't, with the fact that making that distinction is a decision to like preserve an anti-Black world. And in order to like end that world, this like desire for governing, you know, what is good and bad according to this kind of Christian order of things has to die as well. So I think, and I think, you know, I think it comes out of like a good place, but I'm just like, where do you think these ideas that God is on the side of the poor and oppressed came from? Like that, I mean, I think a lot of people are like, well, that's the core idea of Christianity. And it's like, yeah, kind of, but also like not. Like, like historically, like it's not like that's been a kind of like uncontested approach of Christianity or the church. And right, in the contemporary period, it's only through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and work on the part of Black people and Latin American liberation theologians, or, you know, Native American theologians, or what have you, that has become a kind of theological possibility in our imagination. And so to me, when people kind of make that move to say like this is the true liberative core or whatever, it's attempting to kind of gloss over the fact that there's actually a very deep conflict within Christian history, right, about what the true message of Christianity is, and that it's actually like not a settled thing, and that there's actually a fight over theological knowledge and what that is and what it means for reality in our existence together, and that has often been used, and not just used, but that's often been like the source of arranging things in a way that's anti-Black. And so to me, it's very irresponsible to try to like jump over these histories as simply misappropriations or simply people misusing things, when it's like, no, people like had very orthodox theological like rationale for the racial order that they established. And until people can kind of contend with that fact, that the things they think are good or right or true about Christianity are precisely the things that like fund and maintain anti-Blackness, then, you know, I don't think people will be able to get very far in having a kind of Christian existence that's adequate to the demand that Blackness makes of it.
Can I ask you a follow-up about that with respect to, I've been rereading James Cone's God of the Oppressed lately, and I was struck by it just after having read your article in the Bias, because he says in a few places, he talks about the profound kind of disconnect between white Christians being good Christians and at the same time being good racists and white supremacists. And then so he'll say that kind of on the one hand and point out this this kind of irony or whatever term you'd want to say. But then on the other hand, he'll say things like you can only be a true Christian if you are on the side of the oppressed, and then that means affirming that Jesus is black, right?
Totally.
And like, how are we to understand those kind of same things together, or like, what's the intervention that Cone is making into this fight, as you say, for theological knowledge, or the fight to be able to make those kinds of claims?
Yeah, I mean, I guess first I'll just say I think this is probably a place where I diverge from James Cone in some ways. But I think I understand what I understand Cone to be saying in those instances is that white theology has kind of operated as not even black life, black existence. It's not even an afterthought. It's like not worthy of thought. And as I understand him, what he's saying is like, there's actually no possibility of understanding what the gospel or redemption could mean without it being revealed through black existence and black experience, black culture, and black history. And to me, I think the strength of his argument is in his kind of I mean, I think some people think he like just inverts the system, like the theological system, and puts black on top over white or something. But I think what he actually does is more creative than that, because I think what he's trying to draw attention to is how white theology like bolsters a white view of reality. And in order to understand the truth of reality, actually, that you can't have that without it being revealed through blackness. And so to me, the way that he makes kind of blackness and the situation of black oppressed people the starting point for theology, it becomes a way of kind of critiquing this white theological way of producing knowledge about redemption that's actually quite separate from reality and has actually served to like uphold reality that's essentially based on white fantasy of superiority.
Well, maybe we can kind of round the conversation out a little bit here with a question that I think is pretty big and important given the intervention that you kind of just made. So if Christianity, is so complicit in all this very bad stuff, to say it loosely, I guess, like what else is there to do with Christianity? What does Christianity become if we want to try to oppose the violent order of Christianity and deal with the problems of authenticity? Like, do you think anything productive left in it? Is there like a different place to start from?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think a lot of my own kind of, someone who's raised Christian, works in theology, has been very formed by Christianity. A lot of my own approach to it is really informed by both a kind of abolitionist ideas of like harm and accountability and transformation, and as well as like kind of trauma, like approaches to thinking about like trauma and healing. And I guess something that I always like think about when I think about Christianity is how I don't think Christians actually have very good models of like what responsibility and accountability looks like, or like what are practices of like harm reduction. And I think very often Christians like to have a kind of all or nothing view of things that lets Christianity be good, you know? And it's like, oh, if you are like pointing out like the terror of Christian history, then Christianity is just bad. And to me, I'm like, yeah, well, I think Christianity is bad, but it's also inescapable in some ways, how it's affected the world, how it's affected individuals, how it's affected communities. So to me, it's also unrealistic to try to avoid that inheritance. And it seems to me like the responsible thing to do is like become accountable for that by like beginning to like actually like learn what the harm is that it's done, in order to like get specific about like the depths to which it's terrorized the world, terrorized Black people, in order to, and I guess what I'm trying to say is that like in order to reduce the harm of Christianity, one actually has to understand the harm that it creates and perpetuates. And to me, I don't know if you've ever had this happen, but I feel like there's sometimes you can like have a conflict with a person, and I've been this person at times in my life. They're so convinced that like admitting that they've done something harmful makes them a bad person that they actually are too defensive to kind of hear the harm that they've done. And because they can't hear the harm that they've done or like address that, they actually are not able to change. And it seems to me like if Christianity is to become anything other than this like terrorizing kind of force in the world, it has to start with losing that kind of like goodness or complex, and also losing a kind of like guilt complex, right? But being about like getting curious about what the harm is, and beginning to interrogate that in such a way as to like get specific about what that history is, what it's done, and how it continues to work. And to me, that's when a revelation starts happening in terms of like, oh, like I'm realizing like the ways that I feel particularly like called to address some of the specific harms of Christianity, and I can like work on that. Like, yeah, like I don't think everyone needs to like do everything, but I think like getting specific about how one's own situation in Christianity, like what are the places where harm has been done. I don't know if you're a pastor or something, like getting specific about like histories of like clergy people and like racism or something. Like it seems like there's just like room for that kind of contextual and specific kind of like harm reduction practices to occur. Yeah, so I don't know if that's helpful, but to me, I think, yeah, you have to get rid of this like good conscience and bad conscience and like become accountable.
Yeah.
That is helpful.
Very helpful. Helpful to me. Anyway, I'm going to be trying to sort that out, I think, for the rest of this week at least. If you could maybe bring us back to the kind of current moment and how it relates to this, you know, figuring out like the Christian harms, let's say, that have produced like a world in which there's a global pandemic and also uprisings all over the US and elsewhere. You know, how can people, whether they're Christian or otherwise, I guess, think about riots, protests, and the disruption of a certain kind of Christian order in a way that maybe tries to sort of attend to these roots. Maybe that's like a good note that we could sort of end on. You know, where would you like point people toward if they were trying to do this kind of examination?
Yeah, I mean, I think the romance of order is that precisely that it appears so orderly, I guess. It's precisely that it kind of seems to have everything in its place. And that enables us to like not have to think so much about how things are or what we're supposed to do, because order kind of puts us in our place or tells us what place things should be in and how we should be. And to me, these riots and protests and the disruption of that order really highlights how it's precisely under this guise of keeping everything orderly and everything in its place that like Black people are being harassed by the cops. George Floyd being murdered over like a counterfeit $20 bill. What is the kind of call to order that makes it so that a police officer needs to go down and take care of that like minute infraction, something that is like in the grand scheme of things an annoyance for like the person who George Floyd was maybe trying to give a counterfeit $20 bill to, but it's like, look at the kind of effects of that call to order. And so to me, part of understanding these riots is understanding them as a moment of revelation, a revelation of the violence of this kind of Christian and racial order that we live under, and as a revelation that this romance of order is actually built on violence. And even if you're not seeing that violence, even if it's like been displaced to the ghettos or, to the prisons or to, immigration jails, like that call to order is happening it's being revealed right now. And so to me, like, what a Christian has responsibility to do right now is to like not rush to make that kind of categorical distinction between, the good and the bad protester or the true and the false Christianity, but to learn how to like pay attention to what's being revealed about how the world has been operating. And because it's only through attention that you'll be able to like discern the decisions that you're being called to make. And I think those are different for everybody. I think we all have parts to play. None of us can do everything. But I think a lot of people want to just be like, I saw this video and now I have to do XYZ things. And to me, Black lives deserve care and Black existence deserves care and attention. And I think very often that gets lost in people kind of assuming that they understand what's happened or what's happening now or something. So to me, I would just say there's an urgency, but there's an urgent need for care and attention and reflection on what's being revealed, just as much as there's an urgency for action. And it's only when you have those two together that I think you can sustain a movement.
What a great note to end on, I think, and a big challenge to be thinking about too. Before we let you go, we should ask you, you've always got something to work on. It seems like every time we talk to you, there's a new project, and I imagine being in quarantine has got your creative juices going, I hope anyway. So is there anything that you want to plug in the end here? You mentioned the podcast. Maybe you can mention that again, and anything else that you've got that you're excited about.
Yeah, the podcast is something I'm doing with my friend Zach Settle. We were students together at Vanderbilt. And yeah, I'm really excited about the work that we're doing. I feel it's like I think a lot of people hear political theology and think about like either Carl Schmitt or something, or they think about like, Christianity and social justice or something. And it's not that those things aren't pertinent to our podcast, but I think we're trying to kind of carve out a different idea of what political theology is. We've had poets on the podcast, and we're having a tabletop board game maker on the podcast. We've had talking about things like imagining like community and dystopian board games and things like that. We've had scholars, of course, on great interviews or recordings from the Political Theology Network conferences. So I feel like I'm really excited about understanding political theology in a like broader way that is committed to like a set of really diverse voices, but also like really diverse mediums as a way of thinking about what's the relationship between like meaning making of theology and like political legitimacy or illegitimacy and transformation and things like that. So yeah, you can go to like politicaltheology.com/assembly-podcast to see the episodes.
That's great. Well, thanks again for being on the show, Amaryah. It will not be your last time. Every time you're here, I feel like we talk about having to share a story about being at Cornerstone Festival at the same time for a particularly bizarre workshop on making pants out of roadkill animals. And one day...
Oh, right. Yeah, no, that wasn't Cornerstone, though. That was Gathering Around the Unhewn Stone.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
There's so many Christian conferences.
There's too many.
Like, can't keep up with them.
Well, one day we'll have to compare notes, and I'll see how your leather hot pants are going. You can see how mine are going.
Yes.
But we'll have to save it for another time. Maybe that's a behind the paywall kind of thing for sure. You don't want to just release that.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, get those Patreon dollars.
That's
right. Thanks for having me on, y'all. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, not only should you find us on Patreon and support us at patreon.com/the Magnificast, you should also be sure to find Amaryah's podcast that she does with Zach Settle at Political Theology Network. It's called Assembly. It's a really fantastic series of episodes, all kinds of diverse stuff, as you just heard her say. So you should check that out. You can find us elsewhere. We're on Twitter at The Magnificast. We have a Facebook group called The Magnificast Basement. You can email us at themagnificast@gmail.com. And our outro, as always, is by The Illogical Spoon. And once again, our music, our intro and transition is by Amaryah Armstrong. See you next week.
Church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but